I'm here today to talk about the current coronavirus outbreak, particularly with regard to China's role in it. COVID-19, it's technically also known as SARS-CoV-2, which stands for the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. Now it's called 19, or 2, to differentiate it from the 2002 outbreak of SARS, which also originated in the South China area and is thought to have transmitted to humans that earlier outbreak through civets, which are a tree-climbing creature, and horseshoe bats. So what's in a name? What's in a name? Well, everything's in a name. The World Health Organization, a wing of the United Nations, don't like the use of place names or people names to signify a contagion. They feel it's unfair and mean and could cause stigmatisation of that community or that country. And it might be confusing, to be fair, because they'd all be called China. China 1, China 2, China 3 virus, and so on, because that's where they always all originate. And the Trump administration, of course, is insisting on calling it the China virus. So let's put China under the spotlight. They are a major world power, the second strongest economy in the world after the United States, and under trends preceding, prior to this coronavirus outbreak, they're poised to overtake America in terms of GDP by 2030. They're the workshop of the world. They make virtually everything, from the camera technology to clothes. They are, as I said, we used to be the workshop of the world, then America, now it's China. They're a tremendously significant country in the world. They make a massive number of products that we rely on. And with economic strength comes military strength. If they overtake America economically, they will soon overtake America militarily, and they will be the main world power. Since the end of the Cold War 30 years ago and the dawn of the globalised New World Order, America has been the only world power. They have wielded that power under the Bushes, the Clintons and Obama in a fairly bad way, you've got to say, bringing wars around the world, foreign interventions, murdering millions of brown-skinned people, it has to be said, in their wars of intervention. They've unleashed waves of migration around the world. They've turned Western Europe into lands of colonisation, where we've been colonised. They've brought in things like political correctness. They've imposed a uniform and dull Coca-Cola culture on the world. They've turned us into consumers. But if you think America's bad, wait and see what would it be like under China. At least America has a vestige of democracy still, and they had a correction when Trump was elected. And he is against this globalised, interventionist American world. So, if you think America's bad, and has been bad for these last 30 years, you'll see nothing if China was the world power. With the New World Order, the West invested heavily in countries like China, and believed arrogantly that the Chinese would adopt our practices. With increased wealth, they'd adopt liberal, Anglo-Saxon, Western liberal principles. A free press, a free independent judiciary, democracy. These things they somehow assumed would come alongside their increasing wealth. Hasn't quite happened that way. In the same way with the Arab Spring, which was unleashed across the Middle East by Western intelligence agencies toppling regimes in the Arab world, they assumed it would lead to the establishment of Western liberal democracy in those Arab countries. It doesn't happen because there's not a one-size-fits-all, and every country, every culture, every people has their own way of living. It's a form of racial supremacy, actually, this Western liberal arrogance, where they think their way is best, their way should be uniform, and all these other countries should adopt it. And it never works out that way. It hasn't obviously worked out that way with China. I'll have a look at the evidence now for China's behaviour in the world since the end of the Cold War. Now, China, as a country, is one of the biggest causes of the extinction of vulnerable species in the world. They hunt and kill, or they're responsible for hunting and killing by poaching of tigers for their penises, because they think it will give virility if they eat tigers' penises. They are responsible for most poaching of elephants for their ivory, which is ground down and put in their ridiculous primitive medicines. The same with rhinoceros tusks. They grind them down and put them in their medicines. They are responsible for the elimination of these and the endangerment of these species. They even have tiger and rhinoceros farms in China where they're trying to breed these animals for these primitive medicinal practices. They get a free pass. They get a free pass also with pollution. The most polluting river in the world is the Yangtze. It pumps plastics out into the ocean. There's a thing in the Pacific Ocean called the Great Pacific Garbage Dump, which is a huge area of the Pacific Ocean full of plastic, which kills fish and all sorts of marine life. The three of the top 5 most polluting rivers in the world are in China. They belch out fumes from their factories and power stations. If you want to believe in global warming, and I'm not going to go into that now, but if you want to believe in it, they are by far the biggest polluter in the world. Twice the level of America, 24 times the level of us. They produce all this pollution. Barely anyone says anything about it. It's always us that's responsible for this pollution, never them. The strange thing about China is that it is an ancient civilization. They invented paper and gunpowder, for example, and they had some of the earliest cities in the world, but they are a different people to us. In the Dark Ages, in this country even, we didn't eat these strange things. The most obscure things I can think of are Henry VIII. In that sort of time, they ate swans. Henry I famously died of a surfeit of lampreys, a sort of eel-like creature which I wouldn't touch with a barge pole. In some parts of the country, I don't know if they still do it, but perhaps they do, they tripe cow heels, which is a stomach lining. It sounds disgusting to me, to be quite honest, but it doesn't go anywhere near what they eat in China. The French, we sneer at the French for eating horses and snails and frogs' legs. There's nothing compared to what the Chinese get up to. In the so-called wet food market in Wuhan, where this epidemic broke out, first started late last year, the wet market is really a seafood market, but they sell all sorts of other things there as well. They roast dogs live with on the spit. They kill and eat cats, rats, anacondas. They chop anacondas up and eat them, big snakes. They eat civets, which were responsible for that earlier SARS outbreak, which are a tree-climbing creature. They eat pangolins, which are anteaters, scaly anteaters, and they use the scales for these ridiculous medicines as well. They eat hedgehogs. They eat anything you can think of, they will eat. Bats, they eat bats as well. And this goes on, and they're often cooked and eaten live with the blood cross-contaminating in these markets in China. 30% of Chinese people in surveys have said they eat this sort of food. That's hundreds of millions of people. There's tremendous cruelty involved in those markets besides the unhealthy way the food is prepared. But there's also a theory that this virus was manufactured deliberately in laboratories. I'm not going to really go there, I don't know. But you don't know what goes on in communist China. It's a closed society, and to them life is cheap. When Mao introduced what's called the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s, which they tried to move their economy forward, between 18 and 40 million, no one really knows, people died. They just virtually killed their own people by the tens of millions. Do you think the Chinese government really cares about things like that? A dam was built in the Great Leap Forward, and it collapsed in 1975 and killed 250,000 people when the water flooded out. These things are just footnotes to them in their history. To us, it would be a cataclysmic disaster. When this outbreak first came out, they kept it quiet for several months. Actually, an Englishman died in southern China from a flu-like illness that is almost exactly mirrors the coronavirus symptoms, last September. They have kept it quiet for months. They are responsible for this very directly. As I said, life is cheap in China, and they plan over generations. They don't plan for the next general election. They look forward for decades, even centuries. That's how China goes. China is an ancient civilization. They don't look at things individualistically or for a small time frame. And the liberal ascendancy just don't get it. But what have they said? Have they mentioned any of these things? Has Greta Thunberg said anything about this? No, they've kept very quiet. All these ecological issues, they've said nothing. Perhaps because the green movement is actually communists, and the red issue, they don't want to make waves for them for that very reason. The white Anglo-Saxon liberal ascendancy, they don't want to make waves because the Chinese aren't white, they're obviously of a different colour, and so they don't want to make waves for them for that reason either. But more fundamentally, China, because of all the investment that's gone in, we've become totally dependent on them for our products, as I've said before. They make and they provide the Western Europe, the Western economies, with shiploads and shiploads of cheap products which help the keep wages low here. That's also a fundamental reason why the West gives China a free pass. So the West has turned a blind eye to all this, to their human rights violations, the fact that they're an oppressive regime, the fact that they steal our technology. They're no respecter of copyrights. They're a bandit country that has stolen everything from the West. So what's the solution? Well, I think the West should pull out of China. We should relocate our factories. We should refuse to take their products. We must push them back 10 years, 20 years, so we're never put in this vulnerable position again. We should insist on them paying reparations. Of course, our government won't. They owe us hundreds of billions of pounds for what they've done to our economy, and more to all the other economies in the West. We're suffering under lockdown still, and our economy is taking a massive hit, while theirs is actually getting back on its feet. They're starting to produce again. And while our stock market has crashed, they've come in and bought up our shares at rock bottom prices. China is actually massively, financially, going to benefit from this whole crisis. The relative positions of China and the West and America will be altered by this crisis. It will hasten the overtaking by China of America as the world leading power by several years. There can be no doubt about that. That is why Trump is trying to push back, actually. That's why Trump is trying to minimise the impact and talking up the prospect of a cure for the virus. Because he, alone amongst Western leaders, sees the threat of China. Before this even started, he was trying to bring American companies back and impose sanctions on China for their technology thefts. But is it too little too late? By contrast, in this country, we've gone into total shutdown. Our economy will be shut down for several months, and at the same time we're giving contracts for our telecommunications industry to Huawei, a company owned by the Chinese government, and will be responsible for our 5G network, a direct link into our telecommunications. How mad is that? Presuming we can pull out of this globalised world economy, what will we do then? Is autarky the answer? That's the holy grail, the long established holy grail of nationalism. Autarky, self-sufficiency. Well, a degree of self-sufficiency is possible, but we live in a much more complicated world now. There's many more different products, a lot of which are sensibly produced cheaply, and we want to create a high-wage economy, not a low-wage economy producing trainers or t-shirts. We want high-end jobs. But there are problems with a lot of this in supply chains. Just-in-time supply chains make us, if they're spread across the globe, make us incredibly vulnerable to other countries and outside actions, as we have seen now. There's another interesting aspect of this whole China issue, touching upon traditional or old-style nationalist thought processes, and that is in respect of that old chestnut, the Jews. Now, Jewish influence in China is virtually zero, yet the West is supporting China. Western liberalism, Anglo-Saxon liberalism, is supporting China, covering up for their misdeeds, promoting the increase of Chinese economic might in the world, turning a blind eye to it. Under old-style theorising, that should be enough for the Jews to unleash a war on them for control, because they're rivaling their supposed control of the world economy or the banking system, as the supposed theory goes. But this whole episode actually shows that that isn't actually the case, because Western liberalism is underpinning China and the Chinese grab on the world economy. So again, I'll come back to the solutions to this problem. There is a requirement for cheap products. We will always need some products to be produced cheaply for our economy. And the most sensible thing is to get them done in other countries, but we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket. This has taught us we should not become dependent on a country like China. There's a whole ring of countries we could relocate to. Sri Lanka, for example, Bangladesh, Myanmar, or Burma as it used to be called, Vietnam even, Cuba even, Philippines, Indonesia, a whole series of countries in Latin America. We should use many countries to do our products, so our eggs, as I said before, our eggs will not all be in one basket. We will not be in this position again. We must become a high-skilled, high-wage economy. We do not want to be producing the cheaper goods. We want to do the high-end stuff with a high-skilled workforce. And, being a bit selfish, other countries can make the cheaper stuff. We want to be a high-end economy with a high-producing, high-earning workforce. Now, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs now of this virus, how deadly it is, what the correct response should be, but bear this in mind. The Great Recession in the 1930s led to a fall in GDP in this country of about 8%, probably a bit less. The recession that started in 2008 led to a decline in GDP of just over 6%. Now, if we have a lockdown of 3 months, that's 25% of the year. Not all of our production will stop in that 25%, but you've got to think we're going to lose, conservatively, 10% of our production this year. A 10% reduction, that would be a bigger recession. We're facing a bigger recession than the 30s and much bigger than the one in 2008. Countries have gone to war over things like this in the past, which has cost hundreds of thousands of lives. I'm putting that up as a little marker. We've walked into a situation where our economy will retract by a good 10%. That will cause less tax revenue, less money for the health service. It's going to cause dislocation across the country and for people and for pensions, which will have all sorts of health effects anyway. More importantly, this crisis shows that the globalist model is redundant. The free movement of people piling off aeroplanes around the world, spreading diseases, sloshing around the world by their thousands, by their millions all the time. This is an unsustainable model. We need to get back to local supply chains, local production, and build our economy for ourselves and keep our people safe at the same time. This is a Type 27 pillbox, by the way, from the Second World War. So I thought it was a suitable location to do this film. Anyway, if you liked the film, please subscribe to my channel on YouTube. See you later.